So we're back again. About a month and a half ago, I made an entire hour-and-a-quarter long video where you watched as I descended into true madness, connecting things that should never touch, and drawing conclusions with evidence that led to some very interesting talking points, such as the fact that I now consider Dynamax and Mega Evolution to be one in the same, but from differing universes. There were lots of other conclusions that we were able to draw as well, but now we've got a lot more to cover. There's one detail in the newly released demo footage from the second demo of ZA that not only corrects something I believed based on previous trailers, but actually has a massive impact on the chart, which I'm now referring to as the Zero chart. So with all of that being said, let's get right into the second episode of the Zero chart series. Technically third, because I am considering the Rogue Mega Evolution deep dive to be part of this series as well. So I'm really not going to make you all wait. Here's the detail. When the battle against Rogue Mega Victory Bell begins, a pop-up shows up explaining the new feature, Plus Moves, or as I've been referring to them up to this point, Gauge Plus Moves. However, it seems actually that they're more Gauge Minus moves, as they actually take away energy from the Mega Gauge in order to power up your Pokemon's moves. Interestingly, moves used by Mega Pokemon are always plus moves, which implies that the timer for the Mega Gauge might not actually be a timer, but rather the amount of moves you can use while Mega Evolved. However, that is contradicted by other footage we've received from other demos. So why is this so important? Well, it actually has major lore implications. Powering up moves with Infinity Energy is something we've actually seen before in the Galar region. When a Pokemon Dynamaxes, its move pool is replaced with Max moves or G-Max moves if it Gigantamaxes. These moves are vastly more powerful than regular moves, but they can also be used 3 times per battle before your Pokemon is no longer able to Dynamax. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It goes a hell of a long way to deepen the connection between Mega Evolution and Dynamax, and it feels like we're no longer at a point where it can be considered a coincidence. But that's not all. Moves changing in some way due to Infinity Energy is also seen in Terra Style, specifically with the move Terra Blast, which changes time depending on a Pokemon's Terra type. While it's not explicitly becoming more powerful this way, it does give whatever Pokemon uses it the same type attack bonus, so it definitely does still boost the move's power, even if it doesn't seem like it at first. But here's where we stop strengthening previous connections and start looking to something new and very interesting. There is one singular generational gimmick that we've not really talked about in the previous video. We were able to connect Mega Evolution, Dynamax and Terra Style, but it did feel odd that Z-moves just weren't included in that. So now I'm here to tell you that Z-moves do now officially fit into the chart, and are connected on pretty much the same basis as Dynamax and Mega Evolution. So now let's get right into it. Z-moves were featured as the main regional gimmick in the Alola games, and have also featured, like Mega Evolution, Dynamax and now Terra Style, in Pokemon Masters EX. Have a Pokemon hold a Z-Crystal of a certain type, and the moves of that type will be able to, once per battle, be changed into a far more powerful move. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? But there is actually at least one connection to all 3 different gimmicks than this gimmick alone. Of course, the crystals of the different types thing is an instant connection back to Terra Style, which is also based on crystals and types. The fact that Z crystals all have the emblems on them which relate to their type is also very reminiscent of Terrapagos, which has the symbols of all 18 types on his back. Of course, Z-moves are also heavily powered up, similar to Max moves, and as part of Dynamax. And for Mega Evolution, well, it comes down to the fact that, like Gigantamax and Mega Evolution, certain Pokemon have unique Z-moves, including Alolan Raichu, Snorlax, Pikachu, the Guardian Deity Pokemon, Necrozma, Solgaleo, Lunala, and Kommo-o. In the Rogue Mega Evolution video, we discussed how Infinity Energy seems to combine with the Pokemon's DNA to create its unique Mega form. We see this also with Gigantamax Pokemon. It's therefore not a stretch to assume that this is another form of the same concept. It's also very interesting to note that in this instance, unlike with the type-based Z crystals, the unique crystals all require a certain move to be upgraded. For example, Pikachu needs to know Volt Tackle, Alolan Raichu needs to know Thunderbolt, Marshall needs to know Spectral Thief. You get the picture. This isn't something that particularly fits with other gimmicks, at least at first, but actually, when you look at it, it would actually work really well with Terra Blast. Similarly to these unique Z-moves, Terra Energy doesn't change all of a Pokemon's moves, just that one. While that seems to be related to the connection between Terrapagos and Glimmora, the Infinity Energy could definitely play a role in there as well. But I know what you're all thinking. We agreed that the reason that Terrastyle and Dynamax differed from Mega Evolution was because they had been affected in some way. Terrastyle was affected by the influence of Terapagos. When the ultimate weapon hit, the Infinity Energy combined with Terapagos' innate power to create the Terrastyle phenomenon. You also have the fact that Dynamax energy seems to be Infinity Energy from another universe, potentially one that had Eternatus play a similar role to Arceus or Terapagos in that universe. Well, it turns out, without me even having to make any leaps in logic, Z-moves fit into this quite nicely. According to Alolan Legends in the Mali Library, Solgaleo and Lunala gifted the Tapunium Z to the Island Guardian Pokemon as a gift. It's also said that Z-Power is the direct product of Necrozma's light shining down on Alola from long ago. That is what creates the aura that Totem Pokemon have. Totem Pokemon, which are also larger than usual, which, as we discussed, likely comes from the same connections between a Pokemon size and Infinity Energy, as seen in Dynamax, the Noble Pokemon, and the Rogue Mega Evolutions. According to the Alola region's resident professors, Kukui and Burnett, Z-Power may be related to the energy given off by Ultra Wormholes. This, of course, puts it very much in the same boat as Dynamax, in that it would appear that Z-Power is also an alternate dimension's form of Infinity Energy. So the question is, which dimension? Well, that's actually a really easy answer. It's the world Necrozma comes from. Given that, similar to Eternatus' connection to Dynamax, Necrozma is stated to have a strong connection to Z-Power, it's reasonable to assume that Necrozma's homeworld will be where this form of Infinity Energy is from originally. We can assume, therefore, that Necrozma giving off this energy, similar to Eternatus, is basically how Z-Power is given to Alola. So that pretty solidly ties Necrozma in further. We should also bear in mind that, like with Mega Evolution, Z-moves are the combined power of a trainer and Pokemon's wish, and them being in perfect sync. It comes back to that need for a strong bond that is required for Mega Evolution. In the Rogue Mega Evolution video, I discussed that most of these gimmicks don't actually require a trainer's input at all, but the surge of power is too much to take on by the Pokemon alone, so it's shared with the trainer when trying to balance that power. This definitely seems to be the case for Z-moves, with one tiny exception. When using Ultra Necrozmium Z, the animation that plays shows the player collapsing slightly. Necrozma is taking too much power. And that's actually a really interesting point. Why does the player collapse rather than the power just stopping? Well, if Z-Power is a form of Infinity Energy, this actually makes a lot of sense. Like a Keystone, Wishing Star, or Terra Orb, a Z-Ring is a focus for the Infinity Energy surging through the trainer and Pokemon. And Infinity Energy is the Pokemon world's life force, so Necrozma is trying to absorb as much as possible, definitely implying that it's draining the player's life force in some way. Necrozma acting as a vacuum for Infinity Energy is another really interesting concept that I'd be interested to see more of. Unlike other Pokemon who grow enraged and go rogue when absorbing too much Infinity Energy, Necrozma is the opposite. When its light is gone, it's in incredible pain and goes berserk, similar to what happens to other Pokemon when they absorb too much Infinity Energy. When Necrozma gets too much of the energy, it actually gets stronger, not only becoming Ultra Necrozma, but also then getting to use its super powerful move, Light That Burns the Sky. But now we need to turn our attention to why Necrozma is so different. Literally every other single instance of a Pokemon being infused with too much Infinity Energy that's unbalanced sees it in great pain. And while the opposite would almost certainly be true, with it being a Pokemon's life force, the way Necrozma reacts does feel flipped in some way. Its natural form is overflowing with Infinity Energy, so much that wherever it goes, it gifts its power onto that land and onto other Pokemon. You could argue that the same is true of Eternatus in many ways, however with one key difference. When Rose forces Eternatus to absorb more Gala particles, it again goes mad and nearly destroys the world. This is explicitly stated to be a result of Rose's experiments on Eternatus. This means that Necrozma is still wholly unique in its ability of absorbing Infinity Energy. Now I'm sure you're all thinking, but what about the climax of the Ultra games? Necrozma, despite being back in its Ultra form, is still acting berserk, which differs to the Pokemon in Sword and Shield post-game and the Rogue Mega Pokemon. To explain that, you have to consider the situation. Necrozma was already under attack by Lusamine and Guzma when we first meet it. From there, it immediately begins to devour Nebby's light as well as the light of Pony Island, and we immediately try and fight it. It then retreats from our dimension, rather than trying to absorb the rest of Alola's light. Therefore, I think it's fair to say that actually, Necrozma isn't acting berserk when we see it again in Ultra Megalopolis. It's just defending itself. This would certainly seem to confirm what we said before, that Necrozma is acting in the reverse of other Pokemon here. So that brings us back around to the why of why this is. Necrozma is a traveller of all dimensions. Where it came from is a mystery, but we do know that it has been known to both the people of Alola and Ultra Megalopolis for a very long time. It was when the people of Ultra Megalopolis tried to capture Necrozma to keep its power of light flowing throughout the city that it became enraged. So here's the theory. In the universe Necrozma is originally from, the entire universe is overflowing with the light infinity energy. And if Necrozma had a similar role to Eternatus and possibly Arceus in their universes, it could definitely be a case of Necrozma acting as a balance to the universe, absorbing the excess energy for itself, as it can contain, and it uses it to power up. Now, this is a massive theory with a lot of implications beyond what we're talking about, so we'll be coming back to this in a little bit. But for now, there is just one more detail that we need to keep in mind before we take this to the charts. In Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, Kukui explains the origin of the Z crystals to us. They were actually part of Necrozma's prism body that fell off when it came to Alola in the past. This, of course, ties us back to Terapagos heavily. The crystals that make up Terapagos' body also have the symbols of the different types on them, and while we can't see that on Necrozma itself, this may be because it's lost its power, that being its light. It makes you wonder, if Terapagos wasn't infused with infinity energy, would it have the powers it has? Almost certainly not. This does lead us into some interesting directions, with the questions about the relationship between Necrozma and Terapagos still being very much up in the air. We theorise that the Terra-style phenomenon came from the fusion of Terapagos' unique properties and the infinity energy from the ultimate weapon. That infused with the crystals around Area 0, with elemental properties relating to the 18 types, and also the 19th stellar Terra type, which we'll be coming back to, creating the Terra Shards. Terra Crystals and Z Crystals are different, with them being related to different mechanics, but both also seem to be connected in some way. But how, we don't know just yet. Now let's take a quick look at the Zero chart and work out what this has done for us. Firstly, we've been able to connect Necrozma to Terapagos for all of the reasons we've just talked about. I've also connected Necrozma to AZ due to the infinity energy connections. If you've watched the previous video, you might notice that there are a few other changes on here as well, but if I'm being honest, this isn't working like this. This chart is too cluttered and my head was starting to spin, so I've decided to make this chart look a lot nicer to look at. Introducing the Zero Chart version 2. So, the first thing you've probably noticed is that there's no Terapagos at the centre. Instead, he now sits as one of the offshoots of the new central item, Infinity Energy. Yeah, this really shouldn't come as much of a surprise, considering that I've been talking about Infinity Energy near exclusively in all 3 videos in this series. Infinity Energy is a concept that has persisted throughout the Pokemon series, from X and Y all the way to now. And now, thanks to that teeny tiny detail about moves, we can now connect it to every major gimmick in the Pokemon series, from a battling perspective at the very least, which also gives us massive lore implications. As you can see, I've also connected Infinity Energy to Necrozma, Eternatus, Terapagos, Xerneas and Yveltal, Professor Sycamore, Quasartico Inc., Diancie, Mega Rayquaza, and AZ. To briefly cover each of these, I connected it to Eternatus, Terapagos, Necrozma, and Xerneas and Yveltal because Infinity Energy seems to be the basis of which all of their powers come from considering their connections to Mega Evolution, Dynamax, Terrastyle, and Z moves. I've connected it to Diancie due to the fact that Diancie was, until now, the only Kalos and only mythical Pokemon to receive a Mega Evolution, combined with the Mega Crystals from ZA sharing a colour palette with it. I connected it to Mega Rayquaza because Mega Rayquaza is still the only Pokemon that doesn't need a Mega Stone to evolve, although the Meteorite might be a Mega Stone, it's a tad complicated. Professor Sycamore is the leading researcher into Mega Evolution, which is the purest form of Infinity Energy, at least the one in the universe of the Pokemon games that we play, so therefore he is the leading researcher into Infinity Energy right now. I also connected AZ because he used Infinity Energy in the creation of the ultimate weapon, and in turn he has been given eternal life. You can also probably tell that this chart is a lot bigger than the previous, and I've expanded it further with new connections that are not yet ready to be revealed. Well, not all of them at least. You'll notice that with the new Xerneas and Yveltal edition, this does create some more connections. I did this to stop all of the Infinity Energies connections from going back to AZ. Now if there is a connection to AZ, it is more of a connection to either the character himself or of the ultimate weapon. Xerneas and Yveltal themselves seem to be tied to Mega Evolution and Infinity Energy, given their powers, but it's what allows the players to find the Megastones in X and Y. But the full details on that connection is pretty much unknown. Hopefully we'll get some more light on it next week. I've also added a node for Hooper for reasons that we're going to be delving into during this video, but so far it's connected to Naveen because of Mega Dimension, Necrozma because they both share the ability to travel through space, time and alternate dimensions, and AZ again because of Mega Dimension. We'll be coming back to Hooper and Necrozma very shortly. I've also added Dryzner in the bottom left, connected to Diantha, Mulva and Wigstrom because they are all part of the Kalos Pokemon League. I've added her for another reason, but that's for another video. There's also new nodes for Nemona and Geeta as well. Nemona ties to the other members of the Paldea friend group, and Geeta who then ties back to Penny, as well as Glimora and Briar. I considered tying her to Terapagos as well, but due to the lack of actual connections between her and the Pokemon itself currently, I went with the idea that Glimora's connection should cover it. If that changes when ZA releases, then obviously the chart will be updated to reflect that. Oh, and then there's the other important one, Dialga and Palkia. I've connected these guys up to Necrozma and Hooper because of the space-time distortions being so similar to the Ultra Wormholes and Hooper portals. Again, we'll be diving into this in the very next section of this video, but that's what you need to know for now. So that's the new chart. It looks like I've made more changes than I have, to be honest, but the changes I have made matter, and that's the important bit. It's also just a lot easier to read now with the different colour washes on all the different nodes, and also now with the gradients being reversed from what they were before, so you can actually see what's connected to what far more easily. Now on to the next section of this video, discussing interstellar travel in the Pokemon universe. I've spoken briefly about this in the previous section, and even in the previous videos, but now it's time for me to deep dive into the way that travel between space, time, and dimensions happens in the Pokemon universe. Starting with what we know about the main methods. For travelling to other places or times, your best bet is to use either an Ultra Wormhole, a Hooper Portal, or a space-time distortion. They all have similar properties in many ways, but they are also very each unique in their own. Ultra Wormholes are effectively the equivalent of the Time Vortex from Doctor Who, basically, but also more. They're a harnessed way of being able to travel through space and time, if well protected, and it can be done safely. But doing it unexposed would be far more dangerous. I suppose that a better analogy for it would be Torchwood's Rift, which I have mentioned before, mainly because there is that element of randomness in that. The Rift, like Ultra Wormholes, just takes people and things from one place and dumps them in another. This is notably similar to what we see happen to Annabelle, Looker, Ingo, and even Mon. However, Ultra Wormholes are also the only known means of interdimensional travel that is readily available, as it's used by the Ultra Recon Squad, Luzamine, Guzma, and the player of Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, and is seemingly understood by the people of Ultra Megalopolis, and to a far lesser extent the Ether Foundation. The wormholes are created by a number of Pokemon that have interdimensional properties, specifically the Cosmog line and Necrozma. They can also occur naturally, like a tear in the fabric of space-time. Contrast this with Hooper portals, which are only able to be created by Hooper and do not occur naturally. They've also never been shown to cause amnesia in the people or Pokemon that fall through them, at least as far as we can tell. They also seem to be able to travel in space and time and dimensions based on what little we know about Pokemon Omega Ruby, Alpha Sapphire, Masters EX, and Mega Dimension, and the way that they have showcased Hooper. These portals are less common, only appearing when Hooper is particularly active, which we only really see happen in the games that I've just mentioned. It's not a particularly well-used means of travel compared to Ultra Wormholes, but it has been used intentionally during the story of Pokemon Masters EX. Finally, you have the space-time distortions, which you can never anachronize. Is that the word I'm looking for? Is it anachronize? That might be. That's complicated. We'll kind of have to come back to that another time. That's a members-only video, for a linguistic video. Anyway, created seemingly by Dialga and Palkia, but also created by Volo and Giratina. Again, confusing. They often connect to other points in time and space, but don't seem to connect to other universes. There's some debate as to whether they cause amnesia, but given that the player from Legends Arceus can remember little more than their name, it would seem reasonable to assume so. As of now, they've only been present in Legends Arceus rather than a more widespread thing like the Ultra Wormholes or even the Hooper portals. It's also interesting that we don't see space-time distortions in the present day, either, implying heavily that they were really just there during the period of the frenzies, thanks to Volo and Giratina. Interestingly, the only other time that we see the space-time distortions is in Pokemon Masters EX, where Volo and Giratina are also heavily involved and active. So while there are some clear similarities between all three, there are also some very clear differences. What exactly does this tell us? Well, firstly, that we need to look at another character who found themselves with no memories and arriving in an unknown land. Ingo. So what do we need to establish with Ingo? Well, that's sort of up for debate, if he arrived in Hisui via Ultra Wormhole or Space-Time Distortion. In my previous video, I connected him to Necrozma, believing it to be an Ultra Wormhole situation rather than a Space-Time Distortion one. And as you can tell by the fact that I have not changed this, I'm still pretty set that Ingo was brought to Hisui by Ultra Wormhole. They make it a point in the game to compare the player and Ingo's experiences with being flung to the past, with them highlighting the differences. Ingo also has all of the textbook traits of a Faller that can be tested in Legends Arceus anyway, and even starts to gain vague traces of his previous life, a bit unlike the player character, but he's similar to how Annabelle remembers that she was once the head of a tower in Hoenn. You could argue that the player also has vague memories, such as the end of the Daybreak update where they mention the gyms or contests, but then you have to call into question if space-time distortions actually cause the same amnesia as the Ultra Wormholes. There's nothing to suggest that the player of Legends Arceus has forgotten their past, but they don't have a need to mention it. For example, at the start of the game when Laventon asks their name and if they know Pokemon, there is an option to say yes, and the only questions where there isn't an option is when Laventon asks about if the player has a home or knows anyone in the village. Unfortunately, there's not any good way of testing this, as only the player is confirmed to have fallen through a space-time distortion, at least in the main series, and it's very likely that we'll never see this. However, if we were to bring Pokemon Masters into the discussion, Ray, Akari, Adaman, Irida, Volo, Mai, and Arizu all come through space-time distortions but experience no signs of amnesia. We're yet to see characters from Ultra Wormholes in the game, so again, there's no easy way to test this against other evidence. So, from that, we can ascertain that while Ultra Wormholes do cause amnesia, both space-time distortions and Hooper Portals don't seem to. This does make a sort of sense, as while space-time distortions are also tears in the fabric of space-time like Ultra Wormholes, they aren't connecting to other dimensions, and possibly other versions of the same characters, which is something that was yet to be touched on and can create some really intriguing lore. Hooper Portals seem to be much more controlled, connecting 2 points in space-time rather than opening into the full vortex, whether that be the space-time rift, as seen in the climax of every Sinnoh game besides Platinum, or Ultra Space. So to summarise, all of them are used in different ways, but all have similar effects. But why is this so important? Well, interdimensional travel is rapidly becoming important again, with Mega Dimension on the horizon, and I wanted to certify in my mind what we were dealing with when it comes to Hooper, at least as far as we know for now. But now we've looked into all of this, we're going to continue on the Necrozma train, but this time look further into the potential of Necrozma and Terrapagos connection, and dive into the Stellar Terra type. The Stellar Terra type was introduced in the Indigo Disc as a type exclusive to certain Terra-style Pokemon, found primarily in the Area Zero Underdepths, or after the Terra Core has been upgraded with material from the Underdepths, the Blueberry Academy Terrarium. The only other way to get the Stellar Terra type is through the Terra type changer in Medali with 50 Stellar Terra shards. However, as it currently stands, there are still many mysteries surrounding the mysterious 19th type, including whether it even counts as a type. On that note, let's look a bit further into it. On the one hand, it is considered to be a type in that there are Stellar Tail type moves, and Terra Blast can become a Stellar type when a Pokemon terastallizes into that type. On the other hand, the Stellar Terra type has no defensive or offensive properties of its own, and the only thing that it does do offensively is that it's super effective against all terastallized Pokemon, rather than being offensive against another type. This is where things get a bit complicated. The Stellar Terra type has no type matches of its own basically, meaning that it's less of a type and more of a power boost. But why is it referred to as a type then? Well, that is primarily because it has to fit with the Terrastar phenomenon, which is entirely type based. So is that it? The Stellar Terra type is just not a type? Well, sort of, but hold on. There's still a few things that we needed to look into with the Stellar Terra type. Firstly, let's look at the Stellar Terra Jewel. This Terra Jewel resembles a crown, with a small model of Terrapagos and the Terra-style symbol on top, and the Terra Jewels embedded with the type symbols around it as well. But there's just one super important, very easy to miss detail that ties all of this back into the first section of this video. On the crown part of the Terra Jewel, there are 18 crystals with colours that correspond to the types. But they're not shaped like the hexagonal jewels that we've come to associate with Terra style. No, they're actually the exact same diamond shape as the Z crystals, which to me heavily implies a connection. These crystals did not need to be added. They're barely visible in most scenarios in-game, so the fact that the design team at Game Freak felt they were so important to keep them on there tells me that this is an intentional design choice. So once again, we're seeing the reinforcement that Z-Power, and by proxy Necrozma, is related to the Terra style phenomenon and by proxy to Terapagos. What this actually means is still a massive mystery. It's one of those annoying questions that we can see, but we can't really draw out much of yet. My best guess is that, like I said before, with the connections between infinity energy and size, there is a similarity in the way that infinity energy works in different universes, with crystals being important in every different use of infinity energy that we've seen so far, so having that diamond shape recurring when type-based energy is involved makes a lot of sense. The other thing we need to discuss is whether stellar type could become its own thing properly in the future. It's an interesting word, stellar. It's a word that usually refers to space, and the other language translations also seem to corroborate this, with the Japanese also being stellar, Spanish being astral, and the Indonesian translating to constellation. But what is the connection between the stellar type and space? There doesn't really seem to be one, at least not on the surface. It actually seems that the type's name comes from the Japanese Sutera, being an anagram of Terasu, which is what they call the Terra types. But that alone shouldn't justify this being the name used globally, and with different words with a space theme all being used. Could it be that in either another universe or sometime in the future, we will see the reveal of the stellar type being an official version of the constantly speculated cosmic type? Now, I'm not for one moment suggesting that this is the case, and that Gen 10 will introduce a fully formed stellar type, but it does seem an odd choice. Terapagos also has a signature move called Terra Stardom, which again implies some astral connection, and it can also learn Meteor Beam, which to me reinforces this idea. And it's not as though meteors are an uncommon thing in the Pokemon world, with Eternatus, Rayquaza, Deoxys, the Giant Chasm, and thus Reshiram, Zekrom, and Kyurem, as well as Tutopolis City, all being connected to meteors. With Eternatus, Deoxys, and the Giant Chasm all falling to Earth, Tutopolis City being formed from a meteor that fell to Earth 1,000 years ago, and Rayquaza eating meteorites in order to be able to Mega Evolve. You might be thinking that based on this, would it not make sense to assume that the connection is that the Great Crater of Paldea was also formed by a meteor? And while that would make a lot of sense, in-game we're told that it was formed by tectonic activity. Now, believe it or not, this wouldn't be the first time that a crater had switched origin stories in the Pokemon series. With Generation 3 saying that Tutopolis City was formed by an underwater volcano, but Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire changed it to be a meteor. But it'd be a bit odd, no? To change up the entire backstory for the Great Crater just a year after initial release. Especially when it's very clear that the Terapagos and its stellar form were created before the release of Scarlet and Violet. You could also suggest that Terapagos, as creator of the stellar Terra type and the only Pokemon to have a unique Terra-style form in that type, could come from space. But it's stated to have been a common Pokemon in the past of Paldea, and while that doesn't rule it out entirely, it does make it unlikely. So what's the answer here? Have I found one piece of data that explains all of this? Unfortunately, no. It seems as though the mysteries of the stellar Terra type are still to be uncovered, and as good as I am, this one is still a bit of a mystery to me. The only thing I can think of is that there's some unseen connection with Necrozma and Ultra Space here, given the Z-Crystal design used in the stellar Terra Crown. Working out what this could be, however, is a mystery for another day, and we've got some more details. There is also the fact that there's the connection between Terapagos and time, and obviously having a Terapagos time Necrozma space theming could be very interesting, but again, you're going to need to justify that and explain it a bit more, because currently we already have Dialga and Palkia, so what is the point at that point? But maybe something for the future. I think that there might be some unseen connection with Necrozma and Ultra Space here, given the Z-Crystal design used in the stellar Terra Crown. Working out what that could be, however, is a mystery for another day, when we've got some more details. I'm still sort of convinced that we're going to get some more details on Terrapagos and Area Zero in Legends EA or Mega Dimension. In which case, we'll move on for now. Let's talk about something that we've been building up to. The continued different uses of Infinity Energy, and thus the game that I honestly didn't think I'd have to talk about, from a lore perspective at the very least, Pokemon Champions. Okay, if you've been keeping up with the news of Pokemon Champions, you'll know that the game allows you to use all 4 regional gimmicks that have been introduced so far: Mega Evolution, Terra Style, Dynamax, and Z-Moves. All of this is possible through the use of the game's new item, the Omni Ring, which you'd think means that it would have a Keystone, Wishing Star, Mysterious Stone, and Terra Orb built into it somehow. But based on some of the discoveries that we're making, I'm not so sure that's the case. Now, first of all, I know what you're all thinking. This is a battle-focused Pokemon spin-off with no story. Why are we considering it for the lore? Well, you'd be right, but that doesn't mean that the lore of the series has no holding here. If, like other spin-offs, the game wasn't worried about fitting in with a consistent lore, why even mention what's needed for Mega Evolution and the other gimmicks to be possible? Just give the Pokemon the right stone and be done with it. By introducing a specific device that allows these different features to all be possible at once, it feels deliberate. Like they're trying to call our attention to it. To me, that has some interesting implications. Now, I'm not suggesting that we're going to see the Omni Ring in a future title like Gen 10 or something. I think that while some people would love to see that, it might be a bit much, but from a lore perspective, it does actually work. You might be a tad confused, and rightfully so. All of these different features use different types of energy and have wildly different effects. But as we've established in both the previous and current videos, all of these gimmicks share one origin point: Infinity Energy. It's true that all of them use a different form of Infinity Energy, with Mega Evolution seemingly being pure Infinity Energy of this universe, Dynamax and Z-Moves being the pure Infinity Energy of other universes, and Terra Style being Infinity Energy infused with the power of Terrapagos. But why is this important? Well, it certainly seems to imply that the Omni Ring is infused with pure Infinity Energy, and more importantly, Infinity Energy that can change its form based on a simple change to the setting of the Omni Ring. This implies that in the Pokemon world, assuming the Pokemon Champions is intended to be set in the same world as the main series games, since X and Y, have now found a way to channel Infinity Energy into different forms, somehow converting it from pure Infinity Energy to Galar Particles, Terra Style Energy, or even Z-Power. So this comes with a number of questions. Firstly, how, and secondly, who? Let's start with that first question. We spoke in the previous video about how Infinity Energy always has a focus: a Keystone, Mysterious Stone or Z-Ring, Wishing Star or Terra Orb. So does the Omni Ring itself act as a focus? Well, it must do in some way, but we can ascertain that they probably have created an artificial focus that can change the way it focuses Infinity Energy, and more importantly, converts the energy itself into a different form. So how have they done this? Well, before we can really answer that question, it might help us to look into the second question that we set out a moment ago. Who? This seems like one of those questions you'd not expect to get answered, considering that Champions doesn't appear to have any story of its own, and the game's not even out yet. But there is actually a pretty big giveaway as to who's responsible for the development of the Omni Ring, and it actually makes a ton of sense. Take a quick look at the Omni Ring. Do you notice anything interesting? I do. The colour scheme. White with gold accents. It's one I've seen before, and one that already has very interesting lore implications. To me, this is very clearly a product of the Ether Foundation. Yes, the Pokemon conservation group from Alola, who have a secret research department, who develop technologies such as the Beast Ball. It would make a lot of sense for them to be the ones behind this as well, as one of their top members seems to tick all of the boxes as to someone who would want to create a device like this: Colress. Colress has been seeking the ability to bring out a Pokemon's strength since his first appearance in Pokemon Black and White 2. In X and Y, he's stated to have been researching Mega Evolution. In the Alola games, he's actively studying Z-Power, and it stands to reason that while the last couple of generations haven't brought him up especially, he'd still be interested in Dynamax and Terra Style, especially since he has a prime Terra Style research facility in his home region of Unova with the Blueberry Academy. He's also by far one of the characters who is most capable of doing this, considering his expertise with technology in his other appearances. We also know that Colress has been researching alternate dimensions and changing energy channels, as that's how he's able to send the members of Team Rainbow Rocket back in Ultra Sun and Moon. So now we're pretty certain that Colress and the Aether Foundation are the group responsible for this device. We now need to go back to the how. Colress has a knack for developing technology, and the Aether Foundation's methods are unorthodox to say the least, hacking bits of Pokemon DNA together to try and recreate Arceus. Is it possible that Colress just took a bit of the Keystone, Z-Ring, Wishing Star and Terra Orb and hoped for the best? Yeah, I guess it is possible, but knowing Colress, this is probably a bit more technical. I believe he has built a device that can simulate the effects of other dimensions' infinity energy. We know that Colress already has a good understanding of Necrozma and its power, being able to make it fuse without causing pain to Solgaleo and Lunala. So it stands to reason that he would be able to convert infinity energy into Z-power. At this point, the legendary Pokemon responsible for these mechanics aren't big mysteries. They've been caught by most of the protagonists. It's not a stretch to suggest that Colress went to Galar and met with the champion to learn more about Eternatus and Dynamax, find its dimensional channel and build that into the Omni Ring. It's probable that the device actually works by changing the dimensional channel of the infinity energy, like Colress did to the Team Rainbow Rocket members. But how would that work with Terrastyle? We've stated before that Terrastyle isn't from another dimension, but is infused with the power of Terrapagos. It's a good question, but one that has a very simple answer. Colress is a machinery master, and the Aether Foundation are very good at research. They could very easily research what causes the Terrastyle phenomenon, extract it down to a formula, and add it to the Omni Ring. Okay, so that pretty much sums up the Omni Ring lore here, but why is it important? Well, it might give us a hint as to where the series is going at the moment. Now, I know I said earlier that I don't think the Omni Ring is going to be in a future title, but I also think there's a chance it will be. But more importantly, it tells us a bit more about the Aether Foundation and Colress, and how they found a way to change the form of infinity energy itself. If Generation 10 is anything like Sun and Moon, celebrating the 30th anniversary of the series, as well as the first 10 generations of Pokemon games, we'll most likely see a ton of callbacks to the past, and it wouldn't surprise me one bit if Colress and or the Aether Foundation returned as part of this. This being the case, could it be that whatever new gimmick is introduced in Gen 10, if there is one, could actually be artificially created by Colress or the Aether Foundation? I'm not saying that this will happen, but I am saying it is possible. Also, could it be that the Omni Ring will appear in Gen 10 and is a way to celebrate the different gimmicks of the series? Sun and Moon including Mega Evolution, and while at the time that was no surprise, it could be that they used that to justify having all 4 gimmicks interact in this game. If I'm being honest, I don't think that that's going to happen. Gen 10 is a very interesting one, with Legend CA being completely a new overhaul for how we battle in the series, and with champions taking over from a traditional gameplay standpoint. There's a part of me that thinks that Gen 10 will be the way that goes forward. It will be what sets us on a path to the future, using the ZA battle system. I'm not going to say it's definite, as it's definitely not, but it is most definitely something worth considering. Now let's move on to some smaller conclusions and our closing thoughts. So, here we are once more. Let's talk about the things that I'm still looking into but don't have time to fully work out because this video is already taking far too long to produce. Starting with Calyrex. Calyrex is a Pokemon that definitely should be on the chart, but I haven't yet added it because the big mystery surrounding it is still, well, a mystery. That being the question of why it has a blue aura when Dynamaxing compared to the red one of other Pokemon. It definitely seems to imply that Calyrex doesn't use Eternatus' power to Dynamax, but what it uses instead and why this is remain a mystery for now. Secondly, I'm also looking into adding Giratina and possibly Arceus onto this list. It's easy enough to do, but the question is why and what conclusions can we draw from this? I feel like there's something there, but I need to wait until we know a bit more or have a bit of an idea as to what's coming next, to understand a bit more about whether they should be on here for now. I'm also now looking forward to seeing what revelations Legend CA will bring in the full game. As while I've been able to gain a lot from the promotional material and some speculation, the full game release will be where I take the fine-tooth comb to find all of the hidden lore. While there's not much in the way of smaller conclusions to draw, there is one piece of speculation that I figured might be an interesting notion. If the next gen does see the Aether Foundation experimenting with technologies in infinity energy, could we see a new form for Silvally? It was their original project, and there is one thing that still has an unknown fate, so it would stand to reason that we might still get to see something new for the Pokemon in the future, whether that's a Mega Evolution or some new gimmick form. But on that note, it's time for this video to end. I'm sorry it's taken so long to produce, but being back at uni does mean that my time isn't as available as I'd like it to be anymore. In fact, nowadays I'm serving on the Union Council, possibly even soon to become a full-on staff member, and it's just a lot at the minute as we get back into the year. Don't worry, videos will still be coming out. I'm still really focusing on the channel at the minute, but I do also have to think about my studies and also where I stand within the Students' Union as well, because that is also something I'm being paid for. Now, just a quick reminder that if you'd like to support the channel, we have got channel memberships available, coupled with the Throne and Ko-Fi links in the description. ZA and Mega Dimension leaks are banned from the comment section, and with ZA so close, I really don't want to know more than I already do until next Thursday. I can't wait for the game to launch at this point, so please try not to ruin any part of that experience for me. Finally, thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. But with all of that being said, au revoir.